The air in Acclimation Chamber 7 was a perfect sterile null. It carried no scent, no temperature variance, no particulate matter that had not been sanctioned by the consortium's Environmental Synthesis Board. It was the air he had breathed for every one of his 22 cycles, a placid vacuum designed to cradle and contain. Subject 734, designated alien by the proctors who had overseen his development, stood at the center of the white-on-white room, his own breath the only disruption in the profound silence. His uniform, a seamless sheath of gray synthetic fabric, was cool against his skin, its fibers engineered to neutralize his own biological signature. He was a ghost in a sterile machine, a carefully calibrated instrument of observation and influence, and he was content. Contentment was a state of optimal function, the absence of emotional deviation. He was not happy, he was not sad, he was balanced. His instructions had arrived on the chamber's integrated data slate precisely 3 minutes ago, the text appearing as cool blue light against the wall. Asset designation Alpha Prime, Kale. Origin, unconsolidated territories, the wastes. Status, high-value detainee. Objective, psychological deconstruction and compliance profiling. Your protocols are authorized. Commence at 19 Wabag. He had read the words without reaction, his heart rate remaining a steady 61 beats per minute. This was his purpose. He was an interrogator, a key designed to fit the most complex psychological locks. His nature, the Omega designation that the consortium had so painstakingly refined and suppressed within him, was the tool. He could project calm, subtly influence hormonal responses, and perceive emotional fractures invisible to standard analysis. He was a scalpel, not a hammer. He had been told this repeatedly during his long years of conditioning. You are not defined by your biology, Subject 734. You are its master. Emotion is a vulnerability. Instinct is a cage. We have given you freedom. And he had believed it. He still believed it. He closed his eyes, running through the pre-engagement protocols. He visualized his own mind as a smooth white sphere, unmarred by intrusive thought. He cataloged his physical sensations, the slight pressure of the floor against the soles of his feet, the whisper of the air filtration system, the faint rhythmic thrum of the facility's core deep beneath him. All was in order, all was controlled, but then something new. A flaw in the perfection. It was a scent, impossibly faint, yet so alien it felt like a physical impact. It was not a product of the consortium's meticulous synthesis. It was organic, chaotic, and utterly foreign. It smelled of ozone after a storm he had only ever read about, of scorched earth and something metallic and sharp like fresh blood. Underneath it all was a current of musk, deep and resonant, a scent that spoke of heat and friction and life lived outside of a climate-controlled box. It was raw. It was invasive. It was alpha. The scent of the asset, Alpha Prime Kyle, somehow breaching kilometers of filtered corridors and pressurized seals to find him here, in his sanctuary of Null. His heart rate for the first time in 4,112 days deviated. It climbed to 63, then 65. A fine tremor started in his hands, a biological betrayal he could not immediately suppress. His conditioning screamed at him. Anomaly detected, threat to equilibrium, neutralize, but another part of him, a deeper, older part he did not know he possessed, did something else entirely. It leaned into the scent, it inhaled. The perfect, sterile air of his chamber was no longer a comfort. It was a lie. And the truth, it seemed, smelled like ruin and rain. He opened his eyes, the blue light of the data slot reflected in his pupils. 1859. It was time. He was an asset. He was an instrument. He was not supposed to feel. He was not supposed to want. But as he walked toward the door that would slide open into the long white corridor leading to the interrogation cell, His body felt like a string pulled taut, vibrating with a terrifying, unfamiliar resonance, drawn inexorably toward the source of that impossible, devastating scent. The corridor leading to sublevel detention was a study in oppressive minimalism. Panels of phosphorescent polymer provided a shadowless, uniform light that erased all texture, making the long walk feel like a journey through an infinite, featureless void. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic hiss of his own regulation footwear against the polished floor. Elian kept his focus on the mechanics of his movement, the precise articulation of joint and muscle, a familiar litany of control that had always anchored him. But the scent was stronger here. It clung to the recycled air, a ghost of a storm in a sealed tomb. It was a contamination, a breach of protocol on a molecular level, and yet his own systems, his meticulously conditioned biology, were responding to it not as a threat, but as a signal, a call. The fine hairs on his arms stood on end, a warmth unspooled in his belly, a treacherous heat that felt like sickness, and something far more terrifying. He reached the final security checkpoint, a solid chromium door set into the stark white wall. A recessed scanner glowed green as it read the biometric chip embedded in his wrist. Subject 734, access granted. The door slid open with a sigh of displaced air, revealing the observation antechamber. The proctor was already there. She stood before the one-way observation window, a tall, severe figure in a crisp white administrative uniform. Her silver hair was coiled into a tight, perfect knot at the nape of her neck, and her posture was as rigid and unyielding as the architecture around them. She did not turn as he entered. Her gaze was fixed on the scene within the interrogation cell. Subject 734, she said, her voice as sterile as the environment. You are punctual. An admirable trait. Elian came to a stop beside her, his own gaze following hers through the polarized glass. Punctuality ensures optimal outcomes, Proctor. Her lips thinned in what might have been a smile on a different face. On hers, it was merely a rearrangement of lines. Indeed, the asset is resilient. Standard psych auditors reported significant cognitive dissonance when attempting to interface. He seems to possess a raw, undisciplined mental energy that disrupts our conventional methods. Inside the cell, the Alpha sat on a simple metal stool, his hands bound behind him by thick, energy-dampening cuffs. The room was a sphere of absolute black, designed for total sensory deprivation, but a single focused beam of light illuminated him from above, turning him into a stark sculpture of defiance. He was larger than Elian had anticipated from the data files, with broad shoulders and a frame built of dense, powerful muscle visible even through the rough prisoner's tunic. His hair was a dark, tangled mess, and his face, angled down, was shadowed. He was perfectly still, a predator conserving its energy. His biological signature is unusually potent, the proctor continued, her tone clinical as if discussing a weather pattern. Our atmospheric scrubbers are struggling to contain his pheromonal output, a primal variant, fascinating and inconvenient. Elian said nothing. He could feel it even through the thick, soundproofed glass. The scent. It was a physical pressure in the antechamber now, a low thrum against his senses. Ozone, wet earth, blood, and that deep, hypnotic musk. It was the scent of a world burning, of a forest growing, of life and death intertwined. It bypassed his higher reasoning, his years of training, and spoke directly to the suppressed core of his being. His gums ached. A slickness bloomed on his skin. He clenched his fists, digging his fingernails into his palms, the small, sharp pain a welcome anchor in the rising tide. Your objective is to establish a baseline, the proctor said, finally turning her head to look at him. Her eyes were a pale, dispassionate gray, like polished stones. Bypass his conscious resistance. Use your unique sensitivities to find the fractures. We need to know the location of the other feral enclaves, their command structure, their resources. Do not be gentle. He is not a person, 734. He is a data source. I understand the objective, Proctor. Do you? Her gaze was sharp, analytical. Your vitals are elevated, a deviation of 12% from your resting state. Explain. Elian's breath caught. He forced it out slowly, evenly. Anticipation of the task, Proctor. A controlled physiological response to prime my systems for engagement. She held his gaze for a long moment, a silent, chilling evaluation. Then she nodded, a curt, dismissive gesture. Acceptable, for now. Proceed. I will be monitoring. The door to the cell slid open. The scent hit him like a physical blow. It was thick, cloying, intoxicating. It filled. His lungs coated his tongue and sent a shuddering wave of heat through his entire body. His knees felt weak. The carefully constructed walls of his conditioning, the years of training to nullify his own instincts, began to crumble. He stepped inside and the door slid shut behind him, plunging him into the stark contrast of absolute darkness and the single piercing beam of light. The Alpha cowl did not move. He remained seated, head bowed, the light glinting off the sweat on his dark hair. Elian walked slowly, deliberately, into the circle of light, his soft shoes making no sound. He stopped a few feet in front of the bound man. The air vibrated between them. It was here, in this suffocating proximity, that Elian could finally parse the complexity of the scent. It wasn't just aggression or dominance. There was pain in it, old and deep. There was weariness. And under it all, something else. Something that felt like recognition, as if this impossible scent had been waiting for him his entire life. The Alpha slowly lifted his head. His eyes, in the harsh glare, were the color of storm clouds. A turbulent gray shot through with flecks of a darker, more intense blue. They were not the wild, crazed eyes of a feral beast from the data files. They were intelligent, weary, and utterly terrifyingly aware. He looked at Elian, his gaze sweeping over him once, a swift, comprehensive assessment. A flicker of something, surprise, confusion, crossed his features before being suppressed. Then he spoke, and his voice was not a snarl or a roar, but a low, rough baritone that seemed to scrape against Elian's nerves. "They sent an Omega," he said. And it was not a question. It was a statement of profound, bitter irony. How brave of them. The words, the voice, the crushing, overwhelming presence of him, it was too much. Elian's carefully modulated control shattered. A wave of dizziness washed over him, and his breath hitched in a soft, involuntary gasp. His body, his treacherous biological self, was reacting. It was bending. It was impossibly beginning to submit. Elian forced his body into stillness, a rigid act of will against the tidal pull of instinct. The sterile training room of his memory superimposed itself over the black cell. The Proctor's voice, a cold, incisive tool, carving pathways of control into his mind. And Omega's response is a biological mechanism. It can be cataloged, understood, and therefore mastered. You are the operator, 734, not the machine. He drew a breath, filtering it through the practiced calm he had spent a lifetime perfecting. Your designation is Asset Alpha Prime Kyle, he stated, his voice a flat, emotionless line in the charged silence. My designation is Interrogator. The dynamics of our biology are irrelevant to the proceedings. The Alpha, KL, watched him, his head tilted slightly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a bitter, knowing expression that did not reach his storm-gray eyes. Irrelevant? Child, it is the only thing in this room that is relevant. They have built this entire sterile world to deny it, but it is the foundation of everything. They starve you, and then they wonder why you are hungry. The word hungry landed in Elian's gut like a stone, awakening a deep, hollow ache he had never known he possessed. The warmth in his belly intensified, coiling into a tight, demanding knot. He ignored it. He was the operator. "We will begin with the location of the settlement-designated haven," Elian said, reciting the first objective from his mental checklist. "Provide the coordinates." Kale laughed, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate up from the floor. It was a sound of genuine, if weary, amusement. "You have a beautiful voice, like polished glass. Did they teach you to speak like that? Did they scrub the soul from your words, just as they scrubbed the scent from your skin?" Elian's composure frayed. The Alpha was not responding to the interrogation, he was conducting his own, peeling back Elian's layers with unnerving precision. "Your attempts at psychological misdirection are noted and dismissed. The coordinates." "I can smell your fear," Kale said softly, his voice dropping, becoming intimate, conspiratorial. The change in tone was more disarming than any shout. "It smells like cold metal and ozone, and underneath it, something else, something sweet, like white blossoms crushed under ice. They haven't managed to erase that, have they? Not completely." Elian took an involuntary step back. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. No one had ever spoken of his scent. It was a non-entity, a variable that had been suppressed to zero. To have it perceived, named, described with such poetic accuracy by this feral was a violation of his deepest programming. "You are hallucinating," Elian managed, his own voice sounding thin and reedy to his ears. "This chamber is a null environment." "This chamber is a cage," Kale corrected, his gaze unwavering. "And so are you, but a cage cannot change the nature of what it holds. Tell me, interrogator, when was the last time you saw the sky?" The question was so unexpected, so entirely outside the parameters of any interrogation protocol he had ever studied, that it broke through his defenses. The sky. He had seen it on data slates, a variable field of blues and grays, punctuated by a solar body or its lunar satellite. A concept, an abstraction. "The sky is an irrelevant atmospheric phenomenon," he recited, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Its observation serves no strategic purpose." "No," Kale murmured, a profound sadness in his voice. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He leaned forward slightly, the movement testing the strength of his bonds. The scent of him intensified, a wave of heat and power that made Elian's head swim. "They've done a thorough job on you, a perfect little soldier, but your body remembers what your mind has been taught to forget. It remembers the sun, it remembers the rain, and it remembers what an alpha is." He paused, his eyes searching Elian's face. "It remembers what it is to be claimed." The word claimed struck Elian with the force of a physical blow. A cascade of alien imagery flooded his mind. Teeth at the nape of his neck, not in violence, but in possession. A scent, this scent, not as an invasion, but as a blanket of absolute safety. A deep, resonant growl of pleasure that vibrated through his own bones. His knees buckled. He caught himself on trembling legs, his breath coming in ragged pants. A slick of moisture beaded on his upper lip. His own scent, the one he was not supposed to have, was blooming in the air, a terrified, questioning note of crushed blossoms and alarm. The proctor's voice echoed in his ear through a subcutaneous comlink, sharp and cold as ice. "Subject 734, your hormonal levels are spiking. Your response is outside acceptable parameters. Re-establish control or I will terminate the session." Terminate the session. That meant failure. That meant reconditioning. The fear of that sterile, painless process of erasure was for a moment greater than the fear of the man in front of him. He straightened his spine, lifting his chin. Your biology will not be a weapon against me, huh? He said, his voice shaking despite his best efforts. I am an instrument of the consortium. I am not an Omega. Kyle's expression softened, the bitter irony replaced by something that looked unnervingly like pity. You are, he said, his voice gentle. You are the most Omega I have ever seen. You are just starving, lost, and you are so afraid. He took a deep breath, inhaling Elian's scent, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second in something that looked like pained ecstasy. And you smell like home. The session was a failure. The proctor terminated it a moment later, her voice a whip crack of displeasure in his ear. The door to the cell slid open and Elian stumbled out into the antechamber, away from the suffocating presence, the intoxicating scent. He did not look at the proctor. He could feel her cold, analytical gaze on him, dissecting his failure, his weakness, his utter biological betrayal. He fled. Down the long, white, silent corridors, back to the null chamber that was supposed to be his sanctuary. But it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison, and its sterile air offered no comfort, no peace. He could still smell the alpha. It was on his clothes, in his hair, under his skin. It was the scent of a world he had never known and a self he had been denied. He leaned against the cool white wall of his chamber, sliding down to the floor, and for the first time in his life, Subject 734 wept. The aftermath was a silent, dissonant symphony of sensory echoes. Back in the pristine void of Acclimation Chamber 7, Elian scrubbed his skin raw in the sonic cleanser, the high-frequency vibrations designed to atomize any foreign particulate. He changed into a fresh uniform, the cool, neutral fabric of familiar comfort. He cycled the chamber's air 3 times, purging it until the atmospheric sensors registered absolute purity. But it was useless. The scent was not external anymore. It had imprinted itself on his memory, a phantom that haunted the sterile air. He could smell scorched earth and ozone in the filtered water he drank. He could feel the ghost of that deep, resonant musk in the absolute silence. He was contaminated. His carefully balanced system was in disarray, a chaos of trembling hands and a heart that refused to return to its placid 61 beats per minute rhythm. He sat on the edge of his sleep plinth, the smooth, cool surface offering no solace. His mind, usually a fortress of order and logic, was a maelstrom. They sent an Omega. You smell like home. The words replayed, looping, each repetition chipping away at the foundation of his identity. He was Subject 734, an asset, an instrument. He was not an Omega. He was not home. To regain control, he turned to data, the cold, hard logic that had always been his anchor. He accessed the consortium's central archive via his wall-integrated data slate, the cool blue light a familiar balm to his frayed nerves. He pulled up the file for Asset Alpha Prime, Kyle. The screen filled with text and diagrams, a clinical deconstruction of a living being. Genetic markers indicate a primal variant exhibiting pheromonal potency 3.7 standard deviations above baseline. High capacity for strategic reasoning coupled with extreme territorial aggression. Leader of the primary insurgent cell in Sector Gamma 9, believed to be the ideological core of the Free Wastes movement. Threat level, apex. There were images captured by long-range drones. Keel in the harsh ochre light of the wastes, standing over the wreckage of a consortium patrol skimmer. Kale addressing a group of ragged people, his expression fierce and charismatic. Kale looking up directly at a drone's lens, his eyes narrowed as if he could see through the machine to the operator miles away. He was the enemy, a force of chaos and disorder, a threat to the stability and peace the consortium had manufactured. He was everything Elian had been trained to dismantle, to despise. Yet the data felt hollow. A two-dimensional sketch of the man in the black cell, The files described his aggression but not the weariness in his eyes. They cataloged his pheromonal output but not the impossible, devastating way his scent spoke of safety and belonging. Frustrated, Elian dug deeper, cross-referencing keywords from his own profile. Omega, suppression, conditioning, null protocol. He found the sealed records of his own development, files he had never thought to access before. They were dense with medical jargon and psychological metrics, a lifelong chronicle of his own systematic erasure. He saw grainy footage from his childhood. A small, pale boy with wide, frightened eyes, himself in a sterile room flinching away from a proctor who held up a series of images. A flower, a storm cloud, a snarling wolf. Each time the boy showed an emotional response, a flicker of wonder, a hint of fear. A low-frequency sonic pulse would fill the room, causing visible distress. The boy learned quickly. His face became a mask. His responses flat-lined. The proctors noted his progress with detached approval. Subject 734 shows remarkable aptitude for emotional regulation. Instinctive responses nearly eradicated. The null protocol is a success. He watched another clip. The boy, a little older now, was in a scent training chamber. Vials of synthesized pheromones were introduced into the air. Beta, neutral, delta, mildly agitating, and then alpha. The boy's reaction was immediate and violent. He had curled into a ball, shaking, his small hands pressed to his nose. The data overlay showed his vitals spiking into the red. Another sonic pulse, harsher this time. The boy cried out. The pulse intensified until he fell silent. Limp. The proctor's notes were chillingly concise. Aversive conditioning successful. Subject now associates alpha pheromones with extreme physical distress. The desired state of biological neutrality is achievable. He was not born a null, he was made one. They had taken his nature and twisted it into a weapon against itself. The pain he was conditioned to feel in the presence of an alpha. It was a lie, a cage built of fear and agony to hold his true self captive. Cale had not triggered that conditioned pain. His scent, his presence, had bypassed the layers of aversive training and spoken to something deeper, something they had failed to kill. The realization struck him not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a painful cracking and shifting deep within his bones, as if a long dislocated joint was snapping back into place. He was not a broken instrument. He was a whole one that had been deliberately mistuned. The anger that followed was a foreign and terrifying emotion. It was hot and sharp, a clean, bright flame that burned away the fog of his conditioning. It was directed not at the feral alpha in the cell, but at the white walls around him, at the sterile air he breathed, at the calm, gray eyes of the proctor. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was a prisoner. And the man in the black cell, the enemy he was supposed to hate, was the only one who had ever told him the truth. He looked at his own reflection in the dark, inactive data slate. The face staring back was pale, composed, a perfect mask of neutrality. But the eyes held a new light, a flicker of fire in the gray. The proctor wanted him to find the fractures in the alpha, but he had just found the fractures in everything else. The summons came sooner than he expected. 11. Sub-level detention, continue assessment. The proctor's command was as blunt and unyielding as ever. This time, as Elian walked the sterile corridors, the journey felt different. The featureless white walls no longer seemed clean, they seemed empty. The silence was not peaceful, it was dead. The faint, lingering trace of Cale's scent in the air was no longer a contamination, but a promise. A whisper of a world beyond this one. When he arrived at the antechamber, the proctor was waiting. Her expression was unreadable, but Elian sensed a new tension in her rigid posture. She was a scientist whose experiment was producing unexpected variables. "The asset has been unresponsive to all stimuli since your departure," she said without preamble. "He refuses sustenance. He refuses to engage with the psych auditors. He has asked for you." The statement hung in the air between them, a request from the prisoner, an anomaly. "His request is irrelevant," Elian replied, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. "My objective remains the same." "Your objective," the proctor countered, her pale eyes narrowing, "is to produce results. Your previous performance was substandard. You allowed the asset to control the engagement. You exhibited a critical loss of emotional discipline. This will not be repeated. You will break him. 734. Use any means required. The integrity of the consortium's security is at stake." The integrity of your control, Elian thought, the rebellious notion so sharp and clear it startled him. He gave a curt nod. "Understood, Proctor." He entered the cell. The scene was the same. The sphere of black, the single beam of light, the man on the stool. But the atmosphere had changed. The aggressive, challenging edge of Cale's scent had softened, replaced by a low, steady current of something else. Patience. Expectation. Cale lifted his head as the door sealed, and his eyes found Elian's. There was no mockery in them now, only a grave, searching intensity. "You came back," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I wasn't sure if they would let you." "Your preferences are not a factor in my duties," Elian said, the words automatic, a reflex from a lifetime of training. He walked closer this time, stopping just at the edge of the light, within the palpable radius of the Alpha's warmth. "They think you lost control," Kyle murmured, his gaze sweeping over Elian's face. "They think I broke you, but that's not what happened, is it? You didn't break, you woke up." Elian's breath hitched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Kyle shifted on the stool, a slight, deliberate movement. "I saw it in your eyes the moment you realized the cage was a cage. They built you to be a lockpick, but they never imagined you might unlock your own door." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "They told you about the wastes, didn't they? That we are savages, feral, a threat to their perfect, orderly world." "You are insurgents," Elian stated. "You attack consortium patrols. You disrupt stabilization efforts." "We fight to be free," Kyle corrected gently. "We fight for the right to feel the sun on our skin and the rain on our face. We fight for the right to form a pack, to choose a mate, to live without our every breath being monitored and corrected by a machine." He gestured with his head to the invisible walls around them. "This is not life, Elian. It is hibernation." Elian. He had used his name, not his designation. The simple personal sound of it was a shock, a key turning in a lock Elian hadn't known existed. A flicker of warmth spread through his chest, fragile and tentative. "Why me?" Elian asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because your scent does not lie, even if you do," Kyle answered. "It calls to me, and I think deep down, mine calls to you. Not as Alpha and Omega in the way the consortium defines it, as a master and a tool, but as two parts of a whole, two people who recognize the same ache in each other." He tried to move his hands, the energy cuffs flaring with a faint blue light, and he winced, a sharp intake of breath. The scent of his pain, sharp and metallic, spiked in the air. Without thinking, without conscious decision, Elian's hand shot out. His fingers brushed against Kyle's bound wrist, a fleeting electric touch. The world fractured. It wasn't a thought or a sound, but a direct, overwhelming sensory download. He felt the coarse grit of sand under his own bare feet. He tasted rain, clean and cold, on his tongue. He saw a sky so vast and blue it hurt his eyes. He felt the warmth of a fire on his skin, smelled roasting meat, heard the sound of children laughing. He felt a deep, abiding love for the ragged people in his vision, a fierce, protective loyalty that was as profound and natural as breathing. And he felt the crushing grief of loss, the memory of a fallen comrade, the searing pain of a blaster burn along his ribs, the same injury Cale was hiding beneath his tunic. The vision lasted only a second, but it rewrote everything. He snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. He stared at the Alpha, seeing him now not as an asset or an enemy, but as a man who had lived and fought and loved and lost. A man who knew what the sky looked like. Kyle was watching him, his expression a mixture of pain and knowing compassion. "Now you see," he whispered, "that is what they are so afraid of. Not my strength, not our weapons, but that connection." Elian stood trembling in the darkness, his world turned inside out. The proctor's voice was a distant, irrelevant buzz in his ear. The mission was forgotten. The only reality was the man on the stool and the impossible, undeniable truth he had just shown him. The cage was real, and he had just been handed the key. The return to his chamber was a disoriented fugue state. The visions, the sensations Kyle had poured into him with a single touch looped through his mind, a vibrant, chaotic collage of a life he couldn't comprehend. The taste of real rain, the warmth of a real sun, the raw, unfiltered emotions of grief and loyalty. These things were more real than the 22 cycles he had spent in this sterile facility. He stood in the center of his white room, the null environment feeling more like a sensory deprivation tank than ever before. He was a ghost, and he had just touched a living man. The proctor had not summoned him for a debriefing, a silence that was more ominous than any reprimand. She was watching, analyzing the new data, adjusting her experiment. Elian knew with a chilling certainty that his time as a useful asset was running out. He was deviating from his baseline, becoming an unacceptable variable. The thought of reconditioning, of having these new vibrant feelings scrubbed from his mind, was no longer just a fear. It was a terror that eclipsed all others. He paced the confines of his small room, the 7 steps from one wall to the other, a familiar, maddening rhythm. His mind raced, trying to fit the pieces together. Kyle's calm defiance, his knowledge of Elian's conditioning, the empathic flash. It wasn't random. It was a plan. Kyle wasn't just a prisoner, he was a missionary, and Elian was his intended convert. He had to see him again. He needed answers, not as an interrogator, but as himself. The opportunity came in the form of a new directive on his data slate. Asset exhibits signs of nutrient deficiency and dehydration. Administer standard nutrient paste and hydration solution. 23. It was a menial task, usually assigned to a low-level medi-drone. Assigning it to him was a test, a leash. The proctor was reminding him of his place, reducing him from interrogator to orderly. It was a calculated move to reassert dominance. Elian accepted the task without comment. He retrieved the sealed, sterile packets from the dispensary, the gray paste and clear liquid as lifeless as everything else in this place. The walk back to the detention level was filled with a new, cold resolve. When the cell door opened, Kyle was in the same position, but his head was bowed low, his posture slumped with exhaustion. The vibrant energy he had projected before was muted, the scent of him dulled by pain and fatigue. He didn't look up until Elian was standing in front of him. "They sent the interrogator to be a jailer now?" Kyle rasped, his voice rough. "How they love their little humiliations." "You need to eat," Elian said, his voice quiet, stripped of the official, flat tone he had used before. He knelt, placing the packets on the floor. It was a submissive posture, an unconscious acknowledgement of the shift in their dynamic. Kyle watched him, his gray eyes shadowed with weariness. "And you need to run. What was that? Elian asked, his voice barely a whisper. In the cell before. The memories. How did you do that? It's not something I do, Kyle explained, his voice low. It's something we are. Some alphas and omegas. Our connection runs deeper than just scent. It's a resonance, a bridge. When you touched me, you opened the door, and my life, it just spilled through. He looked at Elian, a desperate intensity in his eyes. They don't know you can do that, do they? They think you're just a sensitive, a biological lie detector. They have no idea what they've made. They made me a weapon, Elian said, the words tasting bitter. They made you a key, Kale countered, and there are so many locked doors in this place. The confession spilled out of Elian then, a torrent of whispered words in the darkness. He told him about the conditioning files, the sonic pulses, the manufactured pain. He told him about the null protocol, the systematic erasure of his own self. He spoke, and Kale listened, his expression shifting from weariness to a deep, resonant anger on Elian's behalf. When Elian finished, his throat raw, a profound silence filled the cell. They didn't just cage you, Kale said, his voice thick with fury. They tried to gut you, to scoop out your soul and leave a neat, tidy hole. I am a deviation, Elian whispered, the proctor's terminology feeling like a brand. They will correct me. They'll recondition me. No, Kyle said, his voice hardening with resolve. They will not, because you are going to get me out of these cuffs. And then we are going to get you out of this prison. Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. Escape. The concept was as alien as the sky. There was nowhere to go. The consortium was everything. The wastes were a death sentence. It's impossible, he breathed. The security systems, the guards. Systems can be broken. Guards can be bypassed, Kyle insisted. Their greatest strength is their belief in their own perfect control. They won't expect a flaw in their own design to turn against them. They won't expect you. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. This wasn't an accident, Elian. My capture, it was part of a plan. We knew the consortium had a special interrogator, an Omega they kept hidden. We just didn't know who, or what they had done to him. I was sent to make contact, to find you. This was the midpoint, the revelation that shifted the entire board. Elian was not a tool of the system. He was the objective of its enemy. He was not a handler. He was the prize. The world tilted on its axis, his entire life recontextualized in a single stunning moment. He looked at the nutrient paste on the floor, a symbol of his servitude. He looked at the weary but determined man in front of him, a symbol of an impossible freedom. He had been living in a story where he was a minor character, a functionary in the consortium's grand narrative of order. But Kale was offering him a different story, a story where he was the protagonist, a story that might end in his death but would, for the first time, allow him to truly live. He looked into Kale's storm-gray eyes and saw not an enemy, but an ally, a reflection of his own desperate yearning for something more. The choice was terrifying. It was madness, but it was the only choice he had. "What do you need me to do?" Elian asked. And in the darkness of the cell, the barest hint of a smile touched the Alpha's lips. The air in the consortium, once a symbol of purity and control, now felt suffocating, a recycled ghost of true breath. Elian moved through its white corridors no longer as a component of the machine, but as a virus within its systems. Every action was now double-coded, the outward appearance of a compliant asset, and the inward reality of a conspirator. The fear was a constant, cold companion, but it was overshadowed by a new, electrifying sense of purpose. He was no longer just surviving, he was fighting. His first task was information. Cale needed schematics of the detention level, guard patrol schedules, and, most critically, a way to disable the energy-dampening field that powered his cuffs. Using his high-level clearance, Elian began to slice into the consortium's data archives, not with the brute force of a hacker, but with the subtle precision he had been trained for. He cloaked his inquiries as research for a new psychological profile on the asset, burying his true search queries under layers of authorized-looking data requests. He learned the facility's rhythms, the digital heartbeat beneath the sterile silence. He discovered that the dampening field for the entire sublevel was controlled from a single network node in a maintenance conduit 2 corridors away from Cale's cell. A vulnerability. A chance. His next visit to the cell was under the same pretext: delivering sustenance. He brought with him a standard-issue medical datapad, its surface displaying Kyle's flat-lining vital signs. But within its memory, encrypted and hidden, were the schematics. He knelt again, the gesture of feigned servitude now a secret act of alliance. He set the datapad on the floor beside the food packets. The primary power conduit for the field generator is located in maintenance shaft C7, he murmured, his voice low and steady, his eyes fixed on the datapad screen as if he were merely reading medical notes. It is protected by a simple magnetic lock and a pressure sensor. I can bypass the lock, but the sensor will trigger a silent alarm if the panel is opened. Kyle's eyes flickered to the datapad, absorbing the information. A silent alarm gives us how long? 4 minutes, Elian replied. That's the average response time for a Level 3 security alert on this sublevel. 4 minutes to get from this cell to the surface. Call mused, a strategist assessing the battlefield. It's not enough time. There is a service lift at the end of the main corridor, Elian continued, his heart hammering. It is used for waste disposal. It goes directly to the reclamation level just below the surface hangar bay. It's a longer route, but it will be less guarded. Good, Cale breathed. That's good. Now the cuffs. Even with the field down, they have an internal power source, a failsafe. I know. Elian's gaze met his. The release mechanism requires a specific biosignature, the Proctor's or mine. A heavy silence descended upon the cell. The implication was clear. Elian couldn't just open the way, he had to be there to unlock the final chain. He would have to abandon his life, his identity, everything he had ever known, and cast his lot with this man from the wastes. It was one thing to pass along of information, a secret act of rebellion. It was another to step over the line completely. Cale saw the hesitation, the war in Elian's eyes. He didn't push. He didn't command. He simply waited, his presence a steady, grounding force. They will hunt you, Kyle said, his voice soft, filled with a grim honesty. If you do this, there is no going back. Out there, in the wastes. Life is hard. It's not clean. It's not safe. I cannot promise you comfort. I cannot promise you peace. He paused, his gaze intense. But I can promise you the sky, Elian. I can promise you a life that is your own. The choice is yours. And whatever you choose, I will understand. This was the true test, not of his skill, but of his courage. He thought of the footage of his own conditioning, of the small, pale boy being broken. He thought of the proctor's cold, possessive eyes, the gaze of a scientist at her specimen. He thought of the sterile white walls and the dead, silent air. Then he thought of the flash of memory, the vast blue sky, the taste of rain, the feeling of belonging. The choice wasn't a choice at all. It was an inevitability. The next guard shift change is at 0300, Elian said, his voice firm, resolute. The patrol in this corridor will be at its furthest point for a window of 6 minutes. That is when we have to move. Kyle's answering look was all the confirmation he needed. It was a silent pact, sealed in the darkness, witnessed only by the oppressive machinery of their prison. The next cycle was a blur of high-tension waiting. Elian performed his duties with automated precision, his mind a whirlwind of planning and fear. He felt the proctor's scrutiny on him constantly. She had him shadowed by a silent, unnerving security officer, a reflection of her growing suspicion. She called him to her office, a space even more sterile and imposing than his own chamber, all sharp angles of chrome and white marble. "Subject 734, she began, her fingers steepled on her stark white desk. "I have reviewed your progress with the asset. It is insufficient. Your reports are vague, your analysis lacks its usual precision, you seem distracted." "The asset's psychology is atypical, Proctor," Elian replied, keeping his voice level, his heart rate steady through sheer force of will. "His primal nature resists conventional deconstruction. I am developing a new approach." "Are you?" The Proctor's pale eyes were like chips of ice. "Or is the asset developing one for you? His pheromonal output has a documented hypnotic effect on undeveloped omegas. Perhaps our null protocol was not as successful as we believed." The threat was clear, hanging between them like a blade. Undeveloped, not successful. She was questioning the very core of his being, reminding him that he was a product, a thing that could be recalled and refurbished if it proved defective. "My loyalty is to the consortium, Proctor. My function is clear." "Let us hope so," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "For your sake, you are dismissed." Elian walked out of the office, the cold dread solidifying in his gut. He was out of time. The Proctor knew something was wrong. She was closing the net. It had to be tonight. The hour before the attempt was the longest of his life. Elian sat in his chamber, watching the chronometer on the wall tick down the seconds. 02:30, 02:45, 02:55. Each tick was a hammer blow against his nerves. He wore his standard gray uniform, but underneath he had secured a small, powerful magnetic key he had fabricated in the technical lab, claiming it was for recalibrating a faulty sensor in his own chamber. It was a lie, thin and fragile, but it had passed inspection. At 02:58, he stood and walked to his door. He placed his hand on the panel, feeling the cool, smooth surface. This was it, the last moment of his old life. He took one final look at the white room that had been his entire world, a cage he had mistaken for a sanctuary. He felt no nostalgia, only a profound, aching relief at the thought of leaving it forever. He stepped into the corridor. It was empty, bathed in the low, shadowless light of the facility's night cycle. He moved swiftly, silently, his every movement economical, precise. He was a ghost, just as they had trained him to be. He reached the maintenance conduit, C7. The magnetic lock clicked open under the force of his key. He paused, his hand hovering over the panel, the pressure sensor. The moment he opened it, the silent countdown would begin. 4 minutes. He took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting of his own fear. He pulled the panel open. No alarms blared, no lights flashed, but he knew that somewhere in a distant security hub, a single icon on a screen had just turned from green to amber. The clock was running. He reached inside, his fingers finding the thick, insulated power conduit. He attached a small, volatile energy shunt he had taken from the lab, a device that would cause a massive, instantaneous power surge, frying the system before any failsafe could kick in. He activated it. The lights in the corridor flickered once, violently, then stabilized. The dampening field was down. He raced to Cale's cell, his heart a frantic drum. The door slid open at his approach. Cale was already on his feet, his eyes blazing with fierce, focused energy. "The cuffs," he said, his voice a low growl. Elian stepped forward, pressing his palm to the control panel on Cale's restraints. The biometric scanner read his signature. Access denied. Elian's blood ran cold. He tried again. Access denied. Unauthorized subject. "She locked me out," he breathed, panic clawing at his throat. The proctor. She must have anticipated this. She's revoked my override clearance. From down the corridor, the distinct, heavy tread of security boots began to echo. They were coming. They were trapped. Kyle looked at Elian, then at the approaching sound, his expression grim. The plan has changed, he said, his voice dangerously calm. And then he did something Elian never expected. He smiled. Time for the noisy option. The approaching footsteps were heavy, rhythmic, and multiplying. Not 2 guards. A full squad. The proctor had not just suspected, she had prepared. She had laid a trap, and they had walked directly into it. Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to paralyze Elian. All his careful planning, his silent, precise movements had been for nothing. He had failed. They're coming, he whispered, his voice trembling. It's over. It's only over when you stop fighting, Kale said, his voice a low, steady anchor in the rising storm of fear. He looked down at the energy cuffs still locked around his wrists, then at the thick metal stool bolted to the floor. A grim, calculating light entered his eyes. Stand back! Before Elian could react, Kyle braced himself, muscles coiling like thick ropes. With a guttural roar of effort that seemed to shake the very air in the cell, he slammed his cuffed hands down onto the edge of the metal stool. The impact was brutal, a sickening crunch of metal against metal. The internal power source of the cuff shorted out with a shower of blue sparks and a sharp, acrid smell of ozone. But they held. Kale roared again, a sound of pure primal fury, and brought his hands down again. And again. The sound was deafening. The stool buckled, its bolts groaning in protest. On the 4th strike, the locking mechanism of the right cuff shattered. It sprang open, and Kyle's hand was free. He didn't hesitate. He ripped the malfunctioning cuff from his other wrist, the metal tearing at his skin. He was bleeding, his knuckles raw, but he was free. The first 2 guards appeared in the doorway, clad in the sleek white armor of the consortium's elite enforcers, their pulse rifles raised. They were faceless, their features hidden behind polarized visors. They were perfect instruments of the proctor's will. They opened fire. Bolts of incandescent energy searing the air where Kyle had been a second before. But Kale was no longer there. He moved with a speed and brutal grace that was terrifying to behold. He used the broken stool as a shield and a bludgeon, deflecting a shot and then lunging forward, sweeping the legs out from under the first guard. The armored figure crashed to the floor. Kyle was on him in an instant, disarming him with ruthless efficiency. He brought the pulse. Rifle up, just as the second guard fired. The 2 energy bolts met in a blinding flash of light. Elian was thrown back against the wall of the cell, his vision spotted with strobing afterimages. This was not the calculated resistance of an insurgent. This was the unrestrained fury of a caged animal finally let loose. More guards were pouring into the corridor now, their disciplined formations breaking as they tried to get a clear shot in the confined space. Kyle moved like a force of nature among them. He was not just fighting them, he was dismantling them, using their own momentum against them, his every blow precise and disabling. He was a warrior, born and bred for this kind of brutal chaos. Elian could only watch, frozen. He was a creature of silence and subtlety, a scalpel in a world that had suddenly demanded a sledgehammer. His training was useless here. He was a liability. A guard, seeing him huddled in the cell, broke from the main fray and advanced on him, rifle leveled. "Freeze, subject," the guard commanded, his voice a metallic rasp through his helmet speaker. Elian's mind went blank with terror. His body locked up. He was going to die. Suddenly, Kale was there. He moved between Elian and the guard, a solid wall of protective fury. He didn't have a weapon, but he didn't need one. He met the guard's advance, his body a blur of motion. The fight was short, vicious, and ended with the guard slumped unconscious against the corridor wall. Kale turned back to Elian, his chest heaving, his face streaked with sweat and grime. There was a fresh cut bleeding on his cheekbone. His storm-gray eyes were wild, alight with the fire of battle, but when they met Elian's, they were clear and focused. He reached out, his hand wrapping around Elian's arm. His touch was firm, grounding. "We have to move. Now," he commanded, his voice cutting through Elian's fear. The touch, the command, the sheer, undeniable reality of Cale's presence broke the spell of terror. He was not alone in this. He looked at the chaos in the corridor, the flashing energy bolts, the fallen guards. Then he looked at Cale, this impossible man who had shattered his chains and was now shielding him with his own body. A new feeling began to burn in his chest, hot and fierce, displacing the cold dread. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was a terrifying, exhilarating surge of defiance. He was not a liability. He was a key, and it was time to unlock the door. "The service lift," Elian said, his voice clear and strong. "This way." He pulled his arm free and began to run, not away from the fight, but toward their only chance of escape. And Cale ran with him, a guardian at his back. The corridor was a blur of white walls and flashing energy bolts. Alarms, no longer silent, blared through the facility, a shrill, piercing cry that echoed the chaos of their flight. Cale moved just behind Elian, a protective shadow, deflecting a stray shot with a piece of armor, scavenged from a fallen guard. They were a study in contrasts. Elian, a pale ghost, weaving through the sterile geometry of his prison with innate knowledge, and Cale, a dark, powerful force of nature, leaving a trail of disruption in his wake. They reached the end of the corridor. The service lift door was a slab of brushed metal, identical to a dozen others, but Elian knew the sequence. He slapped his palm against a specific panel, and the door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a dark, greasy shaft. "Here," he gasped, his lungs burning. They scrambled inside the small, cage-like lift, the air thick with the smell of ozone and industrial lubricants. Elian slammed the control panel, and the lift began its slow, grinding descent. For a moment they were safe, enclosed in the rattling metal box, the sounds of battle fading above them. Kyle leaned against the wall, his breathing harsh. He looked at Elian, a grim smile touching his lips. "You're a fast runner." "I've spent my life learning the layout of my cage," Elian replied, the words tasting of bitter irony. His body was thrumming with adrenaline, a feeling so potent and overwhelming it was almost painful. He had never felt so alive. The lift shuddered to a halt. The doors opened onto the reclamation level, a vast, cavernous space filled with the low hum of massive recycling machinery. Conveyor belts snaked through the gloom, carrying the facility's waste toward giant processors. The air was humid and smelled of damp metal and chemical residue. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the upper levels. And waiting for them, standing alone in the center of the cavern, bathed in the cold blue glow of a maintenance light, was the proctor. She was flanked by two of her elite guards, their white armor seeming to glow in the darkness. She was perfectly calm, her hands clasped behind her back. She had not just laid a trap, she had anticipated their every move. She had herded them here. An impressive display of primal aggression. "Asset Kyle," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. It was as cool and unruffled as ever. "And a disappointing, if predictable, betrayal. Subject 734. Kyle stepped in front of Elian, shielding him. "It's over, Proctor. Let him go. Your fight is with me." The Proctor's lips curved into that cold, mirthless smile. "You misunderstand the nature of this engagement. You are merely a catalyst. My experiment is with him." She looked past Kyle, her pale eyes locking onto Elian's. "Did you really think you could escape 734? You are my creation. Every thought in your head, every beat of your heart is a line of code that I have written. I know you better than you know yourself. "You don't know me at all," Elian said, his voice shaking, but he stepped out from behind Kyle, meeting her gaze. He would not hide, not anymore. "You know a subject, a series of responses. You don't know me." "Oh, but I do," she purred, taking a step forward. "I know, for instance, about the aversive conditioning, the sonic trigger I embedded deep in your subconscious, a frequency designed to induce absolute paralyzing terror, a frequency I can activate with a single word." She raised a small remote device in her hand. "Stand down, Asset Kale, or I will break my favorite toy." Kale tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He looked back at Elian, his eyes filled with a desperate protective fury. "Don't listen to her, Elian." But the proctor was already speaking the command word, a meaningless string of syllables that was nonetheless the key to Elian's deepest trauma. The air filled with a sound that wasn't a sound, a high-frequency vibration that bypassed his ears and drilled directly into his skull. The world dissolved into a nightmare of white-hot agony and suffocating fear. The memories of his conditioning crashed over him, the pain, the helplessness, the feeling of his own mind being torn apart. His legs gave out and he crumpled to the floor, his hands pressed to his head, a scream locked in his throat. He was that small boy again, trapped in the sterile room, being broken. Instinct is a cage. Emotion is a vulnerability. The proctor's words, his own conditioning, swarmed his mind, a poison of self-doubt and fear. He was nothing, a failed experiment, a broken toy. "You see," the proctor said, her voice a distant, triumphant echo through the fog of his pain. "In the end, order always triumphs over chaos. Control always triumphs over instinct." But then, through the agony, another presence pushed through. A hand on his shoulder, warm and solid. A scent rich with ozone and earth and fierce, unwavering loyalty. Kale. He was kneeling beside him, heedless of the guards, his body a shield, his presence a lifeline. He leaned close, his voice a low, urgent murmur against Elian's ear. "Elian, listen to me. Not to her. To me. Her control is a lie. It's built on your pain. But your pain is not a weakness. It's a part of you. Your instinct is not a cage. It is your strength." He took Elian's hand, his grip firm, grounding. "I am here. I am with you. You are not alone. Feel it. Our connection. It's real. Her control is just noise. Block it out. Find me." Elian focused on the touch, on the scent, on the low rumble of Cal's voice. It was an anchor in the storm of psychic pain. He looked up and met Cal's eyes. He saw no pity there, only faith, belief. He saw his own strength reflected back at him, and something inside him shifted. The fear did not vanish. The pain did not disappear. But he was no longer drowning in it. He was rising above it. He had been taught that his Omega nature was a thing to be suppressed, a vulnerability to be controlled. But Kale had shown him it was a connection, a bridge, and the proctor had just tried to use that bridge to send an army of fear and pain across it. He realized with stunning clarity that the bridge ran both ways. He closed his eyes, and, for the first time, he didn't push his nature away. He embraced it. He reached out with his senses, not to perceive, but to project. He took all the pain, all the terror, all the agony the proctor was pouring into him, and he sent it back down the connection she had opened, amplified 1,000 times. It wasn't a sound. It was a wave of pure, unadulterated psychic trauma. The proctor screamed, a raw human sound of agony that was utterly alien coming from her. She dropped the device, staggering back, her hands flying to her head. The elite guards flinched, their systems overloaded by the shriek of psychic feedback. Their armor sparked, and they collapsed, twitching. The high-frequency torture ceased. The silence that fell was profound, broken only by the proctor's ragged, agonized gasps. Elian got to his feet, swaying, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he was standing. He was whole. He had not submitted to Kyle. He had not submitted to the proctor. He had accepted himself. And in doing so, he had found a power they had never dreamed he possessed. The cavern was still, the hum of the machinery a low drone beneath the proctor's pained breathing. She was on her knees, her perfect composure shattered, her face pale with shock and psychic agony. She stared at Elian, not with anger, but with a new chilling emotion. Fear. She was a scientist who had just witnessed her experiment achieve sentience and rewrite its own programming. Kale rose to his feet, positioning himself between Elian and the fallen proctor, a silent, unmoving guardian. The path to the hangar bay was clear. Their escape, once a desperate fantasy, was now a tangible reality, only a few hundred meters away. "Come on," Kale said, his voice low and urgent, his hand finding Elian's arm again, a steadying presence. "We're leaving." Elian hesitated. He looked down at the woman who had created and tormented him, the architect of his entire life of sterile confinement. A part of him, a dark, newly awakened part, wanted to see her suffer more, to repay every moment of his pain. But when he looked at her, he felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, just emptiness. She was a part of the cage, and he was leaving the cage behind. He had already won. "Yes," Elian said, his voice clear and steady. "Let's go." They ran. They didn't look back. They burst through the final set of doors and into the hangar bay. The change in atmosphere was immediate and overwhelming. The air was cold, sharp, and carried 1,000 alien scents. Ionized metals, engine fuel, and something else. Something clean and wild that was seeping in from the massive open bay door at the far end of the cavernous space. Through that opening, Elian saw it for the first time. Not on a data slate, not as a concept, but as a real breathtaking thing. The sky. It was not the uniform blue of the simulations. It was a deep, bruised purple, the color of a world just before dawn, and it was filled with more stars than he had ever imagined possible, glittering like a spill of diamond dust. A cold, wet sensation struck his cheek. He flinched, raising a hand to his face. He looked at his fingertips. A droplet of water. Another one fell, then another. It was raining. A soft, gentle drizzle was drifting in through the open door, carried on the wind. Kyle stopped beside him, following his gaze. A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine expression of profound relief and joy. "I promised you the sky," he murmured. They walked, slower now, toward the opening, toward the rain and the stars. They passed rows of sleek, silent consortium skimmers, but at the edge of the launch pad sat a different kind of craft. It was smaller, uglier, patched together with mismatched parts, but it radiated a sense of purpose. A ramp was lowered and a figure appeared in the doorway, a woman with a rifle slung over her shoulder and a look of fierce relief on her face. "Kyle, we were about to leave without you," she called out, her voice warm and rough. "I had to pick someone up," Kyle called back, his hand tightening on Elian's arm. They stepped out of the hangar and onto the rain-slicked landing pad. The world rushed in to meet Elian. The feeling of the cool, wet air on his skin, the sound of the rain hissing on the metal ground, the scent of damp earth, a rich, loamy smell so powerful and real, it made him dizzy. It was a sensory overload, a tidal wave of information that should have been terrifying, but it wasn't. It was beautiful. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes, and let the rain fall on his face. Each drop was a baptism, washing away the sterile null of his past, washing away the designation and the conditioning and the pain. He was no longer Subject 734. He was Elian, and he was free. He opened his eyes and looked at Kale. The Alpha was watching him, his expression soft, his storm-gray eyes reflecting the distant starlight. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead, And in this light, surrounded by the raw, untamed world, he looked less like a warrior and more like a promise. The scent of him was different out here, mingling with the rain and the wet earth, losing its sharp, defiant edge and settling into something that felt like safety, like shelter, like home. The bond between them was a quiet, thrumming presence, no longer a source of conflict or confusion, but a steady, unbreakable tether in this vast new world. Their journey was far from over. The consortium would hunt them. Life in the wastes would be hard and unforgiving. The scars of his past would not fade overnight. But as he stood there with the rain on his face and the sky above him and Kyle by his side, Elian felt a sense of peace that was deeper and more profound than the manufactured contentment he had ever known. It was not the absence of deviation. It was the absolute, terrifying, and glorious presence of life itself. He took a breath, a real breath of real air, and for the first time, it felt like his own.